Hi, I'm Dr. Campbell. Today I want to talk to you about tips for teachers when black children ask questions about racism. And I want to give you 5 tips today. Now, the first tip that a teacher needs to know is that they need to understand the parent's perspective. Whether the parent is from an affluent background or an impoverished background, many of the parents are sending their kids to school because they want them to have a higher quality of life. I can even remember asking my mother about going to school. And what she said to me was, she said, "I want you to do better than I have done." And so inside of that statement, what I realized is that she also expects for the schools to provide her children a fair opportunity. And so many parents, especially black parents, they're just looking for the school to provide their children with a fair shake. The second tip is that you have to consider the student's perspective. You know, some students believe that schools are designed to strip them of their identity. And I say this because many of the rules that are okay in their household are not okay at home. And let me give you an example. In the black community, parents and children, when they share information on an equal basis. They're like partners when they share information. But in schools, the teachers are the power brokers. And so there's no longer that equality. And so that second step, and even though that example is not inclusive of all of the student perspectives, you know, the second tip for teachers is to consider your students' perspective before you have that conversation about racism. Another thing to consider is that there are 2 major factors that are influencing our children. One is TV and one is video games. And what happens is the TV shows that, you know, black children are doing awful things in this society. They don't always depict them in a positive type of picture. And so what a lot of times what happens is they develop defensive mechanisms and they act out those defensive mechanisms through video games. And that's why a lot of times the responses from our black youth are not only violent, but they also result in the destruction of property. And I'm just making you aware of this because I want, you know, before a kid asks you a question about racism, you have to prepare yourself and you have to consider their perspective. Now, another perspective or another tip when you get ready to talk to these kids about racism is to consider the school perspective. Now, the school is put in place to educate the children both socially and academically, okay? And academically means that there are going to be rules and tests and curriculum put in place for them to learn and learn at certain levels. But from the socialization perspective, there are also rules that require certain behavior from the children. And so one thing you have to consider is, are those rules fair for the children? Because if they're not, the kids are going to believe that the school is racist. And so since you are part of the school, they're going to believe that you're racist. Okay, so that's another perspective to consider. The fourth perspective to consider is your individual perspective. What are some of the racial difficulties that you have? Or what are some of those racial expectations? And what it really boils down to is, what are some of your nonverbal and verbal expectations from the children? When you are talking to them, do you expect for them to look you straight in the eye? And if they don't, does that require you trusting them less? Let's say you're teaching a lesson, and one of the things the kids will do is, it sounds like they're talking over top of your voice, but in many cases they're so excited about what you said is that they will talk before you finish. And so, is that verbal expectation going to result in a disciplinary infraction? And so you really have to take a look at yourself and what your expectations are, because what will happen is, if you are challenged, the children will actually see you turn colors. And when you turn a different color, then they're going to know that something is bothering you. And so before that black child even asks you a question about racism, that fourth tip is for you to evaluate your different racial tendencies first, and then decide, what am I going to do about it? And then finally, the final tip for teachers, and this is the fifth tip. When black children ask you questions about racism, use it as a teaching moment, because that's what's going to benefit you, the class, and the child the most. And so let's take this recent event in Ferguson. So we know eventually things are going to cool down and the schools are going to open. And let's say a child comes to your class and they blurt out, "My parents say that white teachers hate black students." Well, if you get upset, then the children are going to know how to push your buttons. If you turn colors, the children are going to know how to push your buttons. But if you respond and you make it a teaching moment, and you start talking about the importance of having rules in the classroom, the importance of having rules that are fair, this is a good time to review those rules and ask them questions like, do you think it's fair? Do you think it's not fair? Now, it doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, but at least give them the latitude to be able to talk about it, because these are the things that make them determine whether or not you as a teacher are racist or not. And so, like I said, you also want to make sure that things are fair. You want to continue that discussion with what your warning system is. And what I always recommend is that a teacher have a nonverbal and a verbal warning system. And the nonverbal warning that I like is called the look. And that's when, you stop, you look at the student, and you kind of like give them this stare. You give them this warning. And see, this is what black mothers do. This is how they warn their children, you about to get it. The second warning has to be a verbal warning. And so, for example, as I stated earlier, many of the kids, when they get excited about what you're saying, they may tend to talk over top of you. And so it could be something as easy as saying, is there something that you would like to contribute to this lesson today? And just take a moment, and they may have something important to say. But when you do that consistently, they see that you're fair, they see that you love them, they see that you really want to educate them. And when you formulate this type of relationship with your children, they will also be more productive. Thank you very much.